Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra, and I'm head of program at the Oslo Architecture Triennale. And as Anna said, we have the second edition of the conversations with our FAP creatives in 2020. This year, 2020, it's OAT celebration, 20th year anniversary. And this gives us the opportunity to look back at our history in order to understand how we have developed, where we are today, and what are the challenges and choices that we are facing ahead. The Jubilee provides also the chance for us to use the Triennale as a pretext to reflect upon and discuss the recent developments that have happened in Oslo, the city where we are located in, and to reach out as well to and invite different voices to take part in these discussions. This was the starting point for the invitation that we did to the FAP creatives to revisit the Triennale archive and select a project, topic or theme that would act as a sort of trigger to elaborate the response seen from today's perspective. We were interested in the approach approach to writing by the London-based artist and architectural writer Will Jennings, and in his focus on the intersections between architecture, politics, place, history, and culture. And therefore, we have invited Will to develop one of the projects that we will now present during this week in the 20th anniversary program. I would then like to invite Will Jennings now to join us in this chat and present a series of 7 essays, Fragments. Following this presentation, we will continue the conversation, and to everyone that is watching us from home, please feel free to participate by sending your questions or comments through the chat. Will, hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Yes.
And to see you again.
Please continue.
So I'm going to do that Zoom awkward thing of just trying to share my screen and then asking if everyone can hear me, and the new world pleasantries that we all do. Bear with me. So can you see my screen and can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you for this invitation, and thank you as well for the invitation to OAT for to collaborate and to write these 7 fragments. In preparation for this, I look back at what seems a long time ago now, because COVID has completely changed all of our understanding of time, and it was actually probably only a couple of months ago, but when I pitched or I suggested what this writing could take. So I looked in it and I wrote at the time that these fragments could be a mix of individuals, perhaps a designer of a temporary pavilion or a local resident who was involved, or a curator or a politician, because I know you've had all these different engagements, and they could be explored in short essays or recordings or transcripts or extracts. And I think what we've created is something fairly close to that. But at the time, I know that I was thinking some of them might be small, like haikus, or they might just be little bits of fragments of text, like Walter Benjamin's Passagian work, or there's little bits floating around. My problem was that once I met these series of individuals that you've worked with, the conversations we had were just so interesting, and there was so much that they talked about that it wouldn't have been fair to try and contract that into a haiku or a sentence. So they've all turned into much larger pieces of work than perhaps I originally intended. But I think there's a lot of benefit from that, in that it allowed a lot of play and a lot of way to explore some of the ideas which OAT has explored itself over the last 20 years. So I'm going to have in this first opening bit, I'm going to have a race through each of the 7 kind of approaches that I took, and touching on the outcomes that have come. But then we can illuminate these and talk about them a bit more, I think, in the conversation after. And I'm going to be referring to some slides, but the slides are only going to be showing what is going to be revealed over the course of the week, and one more tonight, one yesterday, the first one from 2000. So they're little spoilers, if you like, but maybe they're little teasers too, to encourage you to dive in at the end of each day. And something I wanted to do, because Alexandra and everyone at OAT gave me access to this digital archive, of which, as you went further back through time, there was kind of less and less, because when you start on a project, you maybe don't think about needing in 20 years' time to have a collection of bits. So there's a lot of 2019, some of 2016, 2013, but then back to 2000 and 2003, some photos and some news clippings, but not a huge amount. And that was kind of interesting in itself. So I just tried to find some characters or things which I could hook onto, which struck me personally as interesting, but also I felt resonated in some way with both that year's theme and also the overarching understanding of what I took Oslo Architecture Triennale to be in terms of its outreach and its ethics and its kind of way of thinking about architecture. So the sort of the things that I touched on were objectness, approach to design and research, criticality, the idea of memory and about time passing and how that's maybe Oslo and the Triennale have both changed over those intervening decades and how that might have been picked up. Its ethics and ethical stance and legacy. And by doing 7, it gave me a chance to kind of explore different ways of output, like video, audio, types of writing, types of presenting interview, and also carrying out those interviews. And also to have fun, because if I'm going to be producing 7 fairly large pieces of work, I didn't want them to be boring for me to do 7 fairly similar interviews. But also I didn't want the readers, to open your inbox each day and have a fairly similar thing to what you had the day before, like in terms of format or approach. I wanted there to be like a sort of an element of surprise, and hopefully there will be in some of them. So the first year, 2000, I was interested in this idea of the underground, and I saw these beautiful photographs of the time and how a visitor would sort of have to leave the subway system and sort of be pulled into this cavern-like sort of jewel encrusted space underground somewhere. So I talked to Mary Lending, which was published last night, I think, about underground inspirations, her essay for the first catalogue. And we touched on some really interesting things about ideas of monumentality, about how discussions in 2000 were maybe more within the architectural sector and sort of discrete and underground. And by 2019, they've sort of about public and all over the world, people are talking about it. 2003, I was really interested in this object, this by Manier Marley Wigan, who's still a practicing architect, and this inflatable object which just appeared in the centre of Oslo. And I kind of understood this, even though I wasn't there at the time, because I recently graduated from architecture school. I designed some inflatable buildings at that time, and it was very much in the zeitgeist of that sort of millennium, optimistic, reliving the 1960s utopian pop-up. So for this one, because it was such a playful object, and I think this piece is published tonight, I did a completely imaginary interview with a version of myself from 2000. I felt that it maybe wouldn't even be fair to talk to an actual person from 2003, because any experiences can be a very particular personal one. Whereas this is such a slightly absurd but transient kind of object. It made sense in a way to have this kind of poetic reflection on it. And for that, I was also lucky enough to collaborate with an emerging Oslo artist called Jørgen Herksblesser Lie, who's from the Academy of Fine Arts. And I had these conversations with him about some of the things I was touching on about memory and the change of politics over 20 years and place. And he's created these beautiful paintings, which I think you'll see tonight will illustrate my slightly playful text. Here's one of them here, which I think is really nice. It's sort of floating. The more you look at it, the more you kind of do and don't see what's there. I'm going to race through. I've got like a minute or two left. The third iteration was on risk. And from this, I drew from the edition of Architecture N magazine and Ingrid Helsing Elmas, who wrote this introduction here, and a conversation in particular about what risk is in architecture, which sits there as this transcript of a group of excellent people having a conversation about Oslo at the time, the theme and the notion of risk. So I wanted to talk to her about if that was risk in 2007, 13 years later with the climate change and how Oslo has changed and how, all kind of politics have changed. What is risk now in 2020? 2010 was really exciting, where I saw this area of Oslo which was discussed in this project Systematic Reclamation by two recent graduate students, landscape architects, Gro Rudeland, which is I recognise this immediately as London has lots of places like this as well. The Olympic site was one, for instance, the old Docklands, places which are critical to the city, but maybe aren't the prettiest in a cliche form, but really need to be thought about in terms of placemaking, ecology and connectedness. And their project was really interesting, but what I was interested in was talking to them about how, if they were to look back and revisit this project from a decade ago, now being professionals in industry for 10 years, how would they look back at it as a utopian optimism, or would they think it wasn't going far enough, or was it spot on, and has some of it happened? So our discussion, which you'll see in a few days, and then I invited them to do some new drawings and to remap how would they change that scheme now. So that's like a revisiting for them, but also maybe something useful for the city, and critique of the city going forward. 2013, because I couldn't come to Oslo because of COVID, I had this great opportunity to meet an academic based in London who'd spoken at the 2013 conference, Carolyn Steele. So I bought some Norwegian foods and we had a picnic in her house, a socially distanced picnic, and had a conversation about memory, about food being a trigger for memory. What can she remember from going to and being in this conference, and her research on food and architecture, and some of her memories of the time. And that was really, and I turned that into quite a playful video, which I hope you look forward to. I hope you'll enjoy later in the week. We talked about Scandinavian countries and Norway, but being two politically minded people based in London, we obviously talked about Brexit and Britain, kind of the politics that's happening right out my window at the moment. So we couldn't avoid that. It's there, it's present, it's in the room, but it is present in our heads all the time at the moment. Two more very quickly. In 2016, I had this wonderful opportunity to speak to 3 young architects and sociologists who set up this B&B Open, which was a socially minded app from the 2016 Triennale, which basically located or paired up refugees with people with spare rooms or properties, so that there was this thinking about architecture not just as the objectness, but as a useful social function, and also technology. And because there were 3 of them, and because of this connection to technology, I had this conversation with them over WhatsApp, which was actually, over the course of about a month, was a really nice slow way of thinking and talking without having to, in 40 minutes over Zoom, rush through everything that was in your head and then try and catch up after. And then my final one, 2019, with Stefan Kaigi from the Berlin theatre company Rimini Protocol, who created a piece of theatre which was originally in Berlin and then translated, if you like, for Oslo into different language with a different context and different approach to architecture. So I wanted to talk to him about talking about architecture through a different medium, not through drawing, not through writing, but performance, and also how you translate ideas which were built in one city and then translate them to Oslo, and whether he saw interesting comparisons or not between these 2 different places. And so I had an interesting playing format with the guidance of OAT for how we can illustrate this conversation. I think that's something to look forward to. So just to finish, there was something really interesting I think we might pick up in the conversation, Alexandra, about the fact that I wasn't in Oslo. And there's something interesting there about distance, I think, about these would all have been very, very different if I'd have been standing in the centre of Oslo, or meeting in someone's office, or standing outside a building thinking about it. Whether it's been a success or not, I think is interesting. It's playful, but also there's this idea about, I think a success of it would be if it gets added to over years to come. This is basically a framework that at any other point, you guys could invite other artists or writers or theoricians or anyone to kind of pull out a strand or an idea from the history of the Triennale and play on it. And then you're not just thinking about these big lumps of history, but just these moments or characters. So I'll finish talking there, but I think we can pick up anything of that in the conversation. That was a whistle stop tour, sorry.
Thank you so much, Will, for this presentation. And right now we only have the first essay online, but the rest of the 6 essays will come through until Sunday. So it was a really interesting, let's say, overview of what is about to come as well. Yeah, I mean, it's very impressive and very interesting for us, the Triennale, to revisit all these moments that you somehow selected, and to see all these different yes, moments in the Triennale through your eyes. You were very precise in this selection. It was almost like an archaeological research through the materials of the archive. And that was very interesting. One common denominator that you used in all these different essays was using interview as a process. And sometimes interviewing people or participants that were present at the editions of the Triennale, or using, let's say, the starting point as in something or an object, like for instance, this approach that you did to the pavilion, the Larven from the 2003 Triennale. And what is very interesting is to see that the outcomes of these conversations, let's say these interviews that you had for the fragments, assume very different formats. And this is something that you really played with as well. And I would like to know, I mean, what kind of relation then do these outcomes establish for you, with each correspondent edition, and why did you choose them in this way?
Yeah, so I was aware that if I was going to be doing, like I said, if I was going to be doing 7 of these things, there was a real risk that they might all eventually look fairly similar, which is not that interesting as a process for me to do, but also it's really not interesting for people to read each day, like another A said, B said transcript conversation. And I was aware that being distant, not knowing at that point the people I was going to be talking to, not knowing them personally, to introduce and have a conversation with them. And we're all really used to this format of talking now over Zoom, staring at our laptop or our phone. And I was aware that if I did them all through Zoom over like an hour conversation, they might all also end up fairly similar. So I thought about how can I change the process a bit and how might that inform the results? So I tried to look for processes which reflected in some way the theme that we were talking about or the ideas that I thought might be resonant. So with Geer and Anders, the landscape architects, to invite them to kind of revisit their document and do some drawing and then talk to them about that process of revisiting. So that was based in some process that they'd done, some actual design work. Or with Carolyn Steele, to actually in person have a conversation over food, because we're talking about food. So actually to bring food as a prop, and how does that change the conversation? Because I'd never met Carolyn before. So to sit in her room and have a conversation would be quite maybe formal and awkward, but as soon as you've got some rye bread and some salmon and some spreads, then suddenly it's a bit more relaxed and the conversation is very different and it's flowing. And also you mentioned archaeology. I guess it was a bit archaeological to dig through your archive, but I think there was a bit of play and instinct as well, like the artistic approach to instinct, like seeing something from the 2006 and just feeling it was something interesting there, and then having to speak to yourself or one of your colleagues to say, well, I just saw this one photo, or this person said something. Is there some more about that, or tell me some memories about it? So there's some sort of instinct there rather than just archaeology. I think archaeology, now archaeologists are going to get very angry with me and I'm going to get emails that there's a lot of creativity in archaeology, and there is, but a real sense of instinct and artistic kind of play, knowing that I wanted there to be different shapes to each of these 7 pieces. But yeah, very much thinking about the process and how that would change the end result. And allowing them, not worrying if they're not all 100% successful, because they are meant to be playful objects. And, you know, I've never done videos over interview before, so I know there might be some sound issues, but then we've worked playful ways around maybe the sound issues to make it work as a visual document as well for one of them to see. So just relaxing and letting the form shape the content, I think.
And bringing a new life, let's say, to all these moments. I think this is very interesting, and we see that really as a result in this series. There are very different aspects that you came up in your approach, and it's interesting. I mean, you somehow already went through each one of the Triennale editions. But if we go back to the Triennale in 2000, for example, in your dialogue with Mary Landing, and that's a text that's already in the platform, so it's possible to read it. And I really advise that. I think it's a really beautiful text. You were interested in understanding as well, I mean, discussing this notion of monumentality, but when we were talking, you were very interested as well in understanding how the language that is used to write or describe architecture has changed in the last 20 years. I mean, how you talked about architecture in 2000 and how you talk versus how you talk about architecture and describe architecture in 2020. And being a writer, I mean, this issue of language is something that I can imagine is really something that is very precious to you. So I would like to know if you could elaborate a bit about that as well.
Yeah, so it was interesting as well, interviewing different people, what work I might have to do with what they produce. So if I'm having a conversation with someone online, then I'm sort of transcribing what they're saying later, but then I might be turning their words into more of a conversational approach, or I might be para-quoting them in my writing. But with Mari Lending, because she's an excellent writer and academic herself, and she was very busy, so this wasn't like a conversation, it was over 2 or 3 emails. I sent some paragraphs of observations or comment, and then I got this wonderful text back, which was like, I nearly didn't need to do anything with it. I could have just copy pasted that from my email and published it, which I felt would have been a bit lazy because my agency there was kind of missing. But she came out with some beautiful turns of phrase, which you know, which made my challenge of connecting them even harder, because you know, how do you have, when you've got really fine fabrics, you need to do very careful stitching between them. But she said this wonderful phrase about the whole city is about to, oh, it feels like Oslo now, with the way that she talked about how in the underground, which is where the first Triennale was, in those beautiful photos,
yes.
About how that's where the conversation was, but also then she talked about, well, that's where power and capital in Oslo, or Norwegian society and architecture, was, in talking about the underground oil investigations, talking about sort of the silence of certain capital ventures, and how Oslo 2020 or 2019 and the Barcode development and the Opera House is very, very different. It's about display, and it's much more of a language of architecture, which here in London I'm familiar with, the good and bad, about the sort of neoliberal spectacle. And she came up with these lovely phrases about how you know, it's emerged from the underground, and now it feels like there's so much weight of capital and power on the waterfront. It feels sometimes like the city's going to tip up and fall into the water, which I kind of really resonate with, partly because I'm doing a lot of research about water and rivers for other projects at the moment, and about things found in the river. But also, it just came, she really pulled out some really beautiful sort of symbolism and ways of thinking about place. So I'm just trying to read my notes here as well. Yeah, it was very different. So with Mari, we had a very small, and in fact she was so busy when I replied to that one and she sent someone back, she goes, I'm just so sorry that I haven't got the time, and we haven't got the time to actually have a proper conversation about this, because you've just said 5 more things which I really want to write another essay about. So that conversation could have gone into this sort of labyrinthine, which is probably good in a way it didn't, because we'd still be doing that now. So there's a process is knowing when to stop, and when you just have a nugget, and when you can use it, or when you have to kind of spread it over the.
And I guess this that you are describing now, this challenge, this aspect that you are describing now, has to do exactly with the distance, with about, you know, keeping and managing these conversations and doing that from a distance without, because as you said, I mean, the plan was to visit Oslo and to do let's say a study trip here and have contact and direct dialogue with not only the reality of the city, but with all these people that you had conversations with, and suddenly that was not possible. So that also has, I imagine, and as you referred as well, an impact in how then you, I mean, in the result of these fragments, that somehow you had to translate and to kind of understand this relation with Oslo, when you're understanding Oslo from a distant point of view. So that's also something that I think it's interesting to discuss here, and to hear your experience somehow, how you kind of turn that.
I think you're right, and I think it's interesting. Every one of these pieces of writing or video, one of your audience will watch it and go, well, no, he's not right. That bit of the city isn't like that. Or, but then that's part of it. I can't know Oslo. And part of the, you know, whenever you're interviewing someone or writing about something, there already is a distance. which is impossible to not acknowledge. You know, I'm trying to understand what's in your head. I'm trying to understand a place that I've not been. So there's a distance there. But similarly, there's also the distance of time. In trying to understand something from 2003, which was only there for a few weeks, and, you know, even if you were there, or even if I was there, my memory of it would be so distorted and kind of layered with other things that have happened since. There's a distance of time, a distance of space, and the distance of me trying to understand other people's research, theory, and ideas. So the things that I pulled out were never going to attempt to be a truth or trying to articulate the whole of anything, because that you're setting yourself up to fail. And also, I don't think there's much point in that. But more, you know, trying to have some empathy and understand what can be understood. So the distance of not being able to go to Oslo, although it's a real gutting shame, because, you know, the more I've come to research the city, the more I really wished I was going there. In a way, it might have helped, in a way, because it's kind of created that forced distance, which has constantly reminded me that I don't know what I'm talking about. All I can do as the interpreter is to kind of try and understand and then try and articulate, but through all of these distances that have happened. But hopefully one day I will, when, you know, normal times have resumed, that horrible phrase, if we want normality to resume, I will get to go to, you know, some of these areas I've talked about and meet some of these people that I've had conversations with.
I think I'm just going to send a reminder to the people that are watching us at home, in case they want to participate and send any questions. Please do it through the chat. We will be taking them up in this conversation. I think it's interesting. I mean, you talked about the different essays and different examples, and I think it's very interesting the case of 2003, because that somehow was a bit of out of the box, let's say, starting point in relation to the others. And this was because your let's say, you were very intrigued by this inflatable pavilion that was part of the Triennale, and somehow the dialogue was with yourself from your version of 2003, but very much, let's say, through a fictional experience of this pavilion as well. And that's something that somehow situates these fragments in a more kind of a fictional level in relation to the others. And I would like you to talk about that. I think it was a very interesting how you solved this.
Yeah. So there was, as I say, I wanted all these 7 things to have quite a different feel, and it struck me as 2003, I really wanted to consider this Larven pavilion, because it looked so fascinating and beautiful, and I know that it relates to a lot of sort of interesting politics of place that have happened since. But we couldn't quite work out what the best way of doing it was, and we had some ideas and they didn't come through. And like I mentioned earlier, almost to talk to someone who was there would kind of turn it into this very real thing which happened. And the fact that it's pneumatic and the fact that it was temporary, and it was an early iteration of the Triennale that maybe not as many people saw the 2019 one, for instance, means it needed to have some kind of mythical, imaginary status, like a cloud, you know, something that wasn't really there. And because I wanted to have a playful approach to these, it kind of made sense. My real concern beforehand was, and I know even just talking about it here, it sounds incredibly indulgent and kind of a bit self-referential and meta. And my concern was that for the reader, it would either be very confusing, that they wouldn't know what's going on with a version of me who they don't know, talking to a version of me who they really don't know. And also that it might just be indulgent, like, oh, this sounds fun for him to have written, but what's the point of it within this series? So I did show it to 2 friends before I sent it to you, who are writers and, you know, who don't know architecture particularly and don't know Oslo. And they got it. So that reassured me a bit. And I hope tonight, when everyone sees it, they'll understand that there is a kind of a purpose to it. That through fiction, maybe, you can explore kinds of conversations that I couldn't have had if I'd spoken to the architect or someone that visited it or someone that curated it, you know, because they have a very particular vantage. And actually this theme, which didn't really exist in any way, And when you went inside, there wasn't really much in it, I gather. It kind of, it belies that very particular interpretation. So it needed to be something a bit distanced. And by giving it that lack of clarity, like a cloud, it meant that I could then have this kind of joking conversation within it about myself, maybe about how the 2003 version of me, if I'd have been in Oslo, would have loved that. I would have been excited by this temporary thing which appeared and disappeared, by the kind of absurd nature of it, by the weird whiteness on the inside. And I'm quite aware that the 2019 version of me would have looked at it and been quite cynical and gone, well, what's the point of this? You know, this just represents a kind of commercialization of the city. This is the kind of thing we see in container pop-up gentrification projects. So I was also thinking about what's happened with my own reading of space over time, but also what it means about how politics and cities have changed.
So you think that in 2020 we missed somehow the ability to play that we
No, it sounds like you know, having seen what Finn and all the other curators of 2019 did in your last one, it sounds like one of the most playful ones you've done, actually.
Yes, I think it's, yes.
When we talk about the theatre piece later, I know that you were bringing in formativity and pleasure and that kind of side. So no, I was casting no aspersion to point out your program.
I have a question that I think it's interesting to ask you, having in consideration your background as a writer as well. So not you know, zooming a little bit out of the concrete series as well, but I would like to know, I mean, as a dissemination platform, we OAT, we are very aware of communicating with and reaching also a broader audience. And I guess that as a writer, this is something that's somehow a concern that you also share. And what is your general impression about how this type of events, architecture biennials and triennials, interface with the general public?
I think generally they are a force for good. There are, as I think Marina Warner writes about, there are 1 million biennials and triennials now. You know, there's like every first, second, third, fourth city in most countries have got architectural and usually art biennials, which is not a bad thing. It's become quite an industry. I haven't been to the Oslo Triennale, obviously, although now I know an awful lot about it. And I do get the sense that yourselves are quite interested in, as you say, that kind of reaching out into different audiences, more than just being a talking shop between developers and architects with, you know, their like-minded peers. And I think that's just more important now than even before. And I was always, you know, as a little kid, I wanted to be an architect and I wanted to work in architecture, and I did for a bit. But I kind of got out, and one of the reasons I got out of working in architecture is that it wasn't, for me personally, it wasn't really ticking all of the things that I was really interested in architecture. Sitting down and working it on a building or in conservation as I wasn't really getting to really think creatively, being part of that system. I wasn't thinking about how it intersects with politics and economics and the sort of social issues and creative issues that I was interested in personally. And I also found that whenever I talked to someone about, oh, you work in architecture or you're interested in architecture, the first question would be, oh, what's your favorite building? Or, you know, architecture's a bit boring, you know, everyone wears black polo neck shirts and they all just talk shit. And actually, that really bothered me, because architecture for me is like people that can't cross the road to get to the shop, or why is the centre of London being built in luxury flats for people that can't afford it? You know, all these other issues. So by being outside of it, and there are lots of excellent people outside of it now in art and writing and activism and public and even politics increasingly, get all of that now. And they do interface with architects better. There's still a lot of architects and architectural organisations that kind of feel safer just talking to each other in a certain type of language. And that's really important, and that has to happen, and that's great. But I don't think it really helps the wider discussion. And now I'm going to get emails and tweets from people in architecture who are angry now. I think it's really important. I'm not saying all things have to be, but I think there are, you know, people that can write about architecture or make art about it or talk about it for the general audience, and then lure them in, maybe talk to people about the river or talk to them about, you know, this theatre performance or something. And by the end of it, they realised they were actually talking about architecture and cities and politics all along. But if you'd have told them, do you want to come to this event about architecture? They'd go, no, I'm not really into architecture. So it's kind of to lure people in with something and then have fun.
I think that's interesting because in your selection of the let's say the elements in our materials or elements in the archive, this is very visible. And for example, in the 2013 Triennale, you chose a topic which was food, and then chose to talk, we interview Caroline Steele about food, and you talk about food as experience. I saw it when reading that very much food as politics as well, and let's say how food impacts the way we live and organize our cities as well. So this is something that I think it's really interesting in relation to what we were just referring right now. And I was wondering if you would like to talk a little bit more about that dialogue with Caroline. I mean, what's let's say starting points and triggers you would like to highlight there?
It's exactly to talk about those things which shape art, because architecture is not really shaped by architects. You know, they do get to do some nice designing, and some of them do some excellent projects, but really the things which shape built form and the places we live are other systems. They're systems of finance, of capital, of politics, of ideology, of land ownership and viewing corridors and all sorts of things which really the architect or designer has no agency about. It's their job to kind of create the thing in the middle and manage the budget and stuff. And there is some scope for excellence within that. But to talk about architecture with someone like Carolyn, who thinks about food and history of food and how that shaped cities and society, then you're talking about architecture, because you know, you talk about the buildings in which have to create and deliver and process and sell and prepare this food. You're talking about the very form of, you know, she talks, I don't think it's in the final film, but she talks in her talks about road names in cities, about how they're named, like Cow Lane, about, you know, Abattoir Avenue and things like that, and about how they're really embedded not only into the names we give places, but why that road goes from there to there, why, you know, the shapes of the farms and the landscapes in which we live. So to talk with people who are interested in other areas but intersect with architecture is, for me, it's a really interesting way of talking about architecture. And also, Carolyn is a great example, because when I was asked, you know, to talk to 6 or 7 people, I also got a chance to look through your archive and decide, well, who's really interesting? Who would I just really like to have a conversation with? And luckily, you've got an awful lot of people that I would just love to have sat down in a pub and had a conversation with over an hour. But in lieu of a pub, I had to do some of them over Zoom. But and Carolyn was one of those people. You know, she's someone I had come across in bits of my research and reading before. I'd never met, although we now know there are lots of connections between us in terms of people and places we've taught and things. But it was just, you know, one excuse to go and have an hour conversation and some lunch with someone without the awkward pleasantries of sort of approaching them after a conference and going, hello, I really like that thing you wrote. But just having the framework of, I've been asked to do this interview, and then immediately you're getting on like a house on fire. And to do that with, you know, 6 different groups of people was a great pleasure.
I guess that, you know, after doing this series and your impression of OAT and your knowledge of OAT through all these, let's say, entering points, has, you know, I'm very curious to understand how you see OAT and how you see the development of the Triennale throughout these 20 years, let's say, from your point of view and from your contact with these different.
Yeah, I think like that thing I mentioned earlier that Mari Lending talked about is still a really interesting arc about how it started off sort of underground. I think she spoke particularly about how she suspects not that many people came to that Triennale, although many did, I'm sure, but compared to how it latterly has become.
It was more local, let's say, because before 2013 is like the year that marked the let's say, the first launch, international launch for call for curators. And so in 2000 was the first Triennale, so it was, let's say, more local, more intern, let's say.
Yeah, and local's good as well, because especially as the way you've gone through from being in a particular place, that even some people in that underground station might not have known to go through that corridor to find it. So it was a base, even within a real place, it was kind of secreted and hidden. You had to find. And now, you know, the last year one, which was kind of mediated all over the world, it was written about in different press all over the place, and there's videos of it. You've got a lot more in your digital archive about it, and people travelled from all over to come see it. So it has gone from this local to this global, but also in digital reach. I don't know if I can really answer that, because I think part of the reason that you've created this 20th anniversary, looking back, is so that you and yourself and a team can kind of think about that. And maybe it's even not that me or Mies TV or 45 Degrees or any of the other people you've invited in can really, because it's just huge. Each one of them is big, but as a 20-year thing, it's a bit big to try and understand, especially, like, as I say, as an outsider that's come in and is just trying to get a handle on just 7 elements of it. So I can sort of see a shape, but it might be a bit prescriptive or a bit clunky observation. And I think maybe you won't even know until maybe you've done a few more and you look back and you go, there is a bit more of a shape now. I don't know. Where do you see it going for the next 20 years? Maybe is a better question.
Yes, well, actually this year is very much an exercise for ourselves for that. This is sort of a year that we decided, okay, let's take this opportunity actually to look back and to focus on that, but to look back not just with the aim of looking back, but also to understand where we are now and how do we want to, or how we should move forward. So that's very much the meaning of this year, let's say, what we are working with. Yes, I think that we are now very close to wrapping up this conversation. I would like, it has been really interesting to talk with you about this process and this experience and everything that's, let's say, that you have worked through in order to get these essays that we are now publishing, and your experience, let's say, your view of it, because that's, although you say you don't have really kind of an answer to how you see, I think that having your view, having your perspective, having your selection about the different editions, that is something that it's really, really interesting for us to see. But before we end, I would like to ask you, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
No, just the normal pleasantries of thank you for the invitation to kind of to think about things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about before, like you know, I read about food architecture, but I wouldn't get the opportunity to really spend a few days kind of thinking about it and meeting someone and then trying to turn that into a conversation or an argument, and all of the other topics. But also, like, that element of play, to do 7 pieces of writing. As a writer or any kind of creative person, it's quite easy to often, because you get asked to maybe do something similar to what you've done before, you know, to sort of get into a bit of that. So to have this sort of like this table of which I can have a feast of 7 different types of doing something: video, audio, fiction, essay, transcript, all sorts of things, is kind of a good stretch of the muscles. And I think there might be some interesting things in it. Like I say, some might be a bit not the best pieces of writing ever, I don't know, but then maybe other people will like others more than other ones. I think that's part of the smorgasbord of what this kind of playful approach is. And then also just to thank, as well as yourselves and your team, who have been very helpful in kind of at short notice when I said, oh, do you have a PDF of this catalogue? And then 20 minutes later, someone's emailed it through to me. Is to thank FAP, the Future Architecture Platform, who kind of set up this opportunity and other opportunities, and for many, many other. I'm always a bit nervous when you introduced and you said young, because I think they used the word future, which also is like, it's a bit scary because I'm not that young now. I think for Future Architects Platform,
I'm not that young as well.
I encourage everybody listening to this, if there's some students or anyone, to apply to Future Architecture Platform next year. But I think you have to be within like 2 years or 3 years of graduating from an architecture related course. And because I happen to have done a research degree a bit more mature, it meant I could apply. But it also means that whenever I see phrases like young and future, it makes me slightly terrified. But they've been great, and it's been a real pleasure to be introduced through them to yourselves and other organisations too.
Thank you so much. For us, it has been a pleasure to collaborate with you. And then I would like to invite everyone to explore this series of texts. Later today at 8 p.m. we will launch the second fragment, and then we will continue throughout the week until Sunday. So in total it will be 7 texts that form this series. And then I would like just to say that we are back on Thursday at 6 o'clock, this time for a conversation with the curators of the various editions of the Triennale until now. And on Friday at 12 o'clock, we will close this series of In Conversations with the third Future Architecture Platform team, which is Mies TV. Thank you for being with us. Will, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been a huge pleasure. And then we continue the dialogue.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and good luck for the next 20 years.
Thank you.
Thank you.